Hey guys, welcome to the next section where we're going to be starting to look at snares now. So we covered most of everything that we're going to cover until the very end of the course on kicks, the basics of kicks and processing and all that. So now we're going to do the same process with snares. So the same ideals and philosophies apply for snares as do kicks, and this is regardless of what genre you're working in. You need good samples. That's the first and foremost thing. If you have good samples, the whole process becomes 10 times easier. Now, the cool thing with snares as opposed to kicks, you don't typically have to tune them. Now, you will tune certain snares in certain genres like dubstep and drum and bass and things like that, and we'll look at an example of that in a second, or in a few minutes or so. But typically with snares, you have a little bit more freedom to really carve and kind of create your own sound, right? So the kick, there's certain elements that a kick has to have. It has to have those three elements we talked about, has to be subby, punchy, etc. Well, the snare is one of the only tracks or parts of the drum track that you can really kind of put your own sonic stamp or imprint on. And by that, I mean you can layer your own snares, you can buy sample packs, and then, layer different samples and things together to make your own, specific sound. Tons of DJs, tons of producers, they all have that snare sound or, maybe a clap sound that they're all known for, like Deoro, Thomas Jack with like Kygo, even some of the guys who do the Melbourne stuff, right? So, that's just really up to you what you want to do. And so there's a little bit more freedom in that, and I think that's fun. So let's start talking about the different types of snares. The way I like to categorize snares there are two broad types of a snare. There is a layered snare and an unlayered snare. And then there's these little subcategories of snares that kind of follow under the layered type or the unlayered. So an unlayered snare is just going to be like a snare hit. Think of like a physical, real snare drum. Or maybe just one 808 snare. We've all heard that sound. Or a 909 snare. A layered snare is going to be multiple sounds together. Maybe two or three snares. Maybe a clap in a snare. Maybe some hi-hats or a sleigh bell or a tambourine in a snare. It's going to be a layered sound. So there's the two general broad categories for snares. Now, in each of those categories, you can have kind of these subcategories going on. And they are, the first one I want to talk about is what I like to call an open snare and a closed snare. So I've never heard anyone that actually call this is one of those things that I kind of trial and error, learned on my own and have my own term for, but bear with me here. So an open snare, there's no end point of the sound necessarily, right? Like it just hangs open with some reverb. Listen to this. Not all of those at once. Let's listen to this. Right? So that's a layered snare that's open. Let's listen to this one. Layered, that's open. Hear how the reverb just kind of tails out? Now let's listen to a closed snare. I don't know if you can hear that. Hopefully you can, or hopefully it's the same as my ear. There's a whoosh. It actually has like an end point, a discernible, audible part where the sound just comes to an end. And that has a really different feel in a mix than a open snare. And I can show you that real quick. So here's the open snare, and we'll pull this into our little progression that we've been kind of dinking around with here, this tropical house progression. So I'll just play, the first few bars. So that's the open feel. Now let's go to the closed feel. It's just a totally different vibe. One's not better than the other. It just depends on the song and the production and what you're going for. Let's listen to this. It has a whole different feel, and sometimes this fits certain genres of EDM better than others. That's just how it works. So there is the first subset category that I like to think of as, okay, is it layered or is it unlayered? Is it a closed or open snare, or is that what I'm going for? Now, the reason why I'm telling you all this is because the same rule applies. You need to get good at not only finding and locating samples that you have or you purchased or downloaded, but you also need to be able to think about your mix in context of your song, because the kick's going to be the first drum thing you typically do, and then the snare is going to be built up, usually, I feel like for most people, after they have some sort of rhythmic content or melodic content. So you do need to be aware of, do you want that focus to really kind of, the ear to really drift to that snare? If so, a closed snare might be better, or if you just want it to kind of be a presence but not something the ear is drifting towards. A layered open snare might be better. And the open snare is just kind of hang with some reverb, and sometimes that's in the samples, sometimes you have to do that. So let's go through some of these other snare samples over here real quick. There's this one we already heard. It's a layered 808-ish type snare. Has a clap in that one. That one has a gated reverb. So that's another subset you can have, are these little tail effects on your snares, and high quality samples will have this. This is an echo snare, and you can see right here, if I zoom in, here's the main part of the snare, like right there, and then there's this last little section right in here that is the gated reverb coming up. Makes a really cool sound. It kind of makes it bounce back into the next percussion hit. Another layered snare. That one has a bit of a tune to it. All right, this one's cool because there's another subset category you can have with your snares. So inside a layered or unlayered, closed or open, you can have what's called a pre-delay snare. And basically what that is it's kind of like a kick where it has a different sound that might be the attack stage of the sound. You can see that right here. So this section, I'll cut it up so you can actually really hear this and see this. This right here is the where the snare is looking like it's really starting. So let me cut this again. So right in here is where the snare looks like it's really starting. See, that's the snare sound. What's that whole section I just cut off? It's like a noise. Sometimes it's a finger snap or a clap or some really short sample that happens right before the actual snare hits. It gets a really cool sound for sure. You use it in dubstep, progressive, a lot of genres of EDM will use this, obviously. It makes for a really cool vibe. So there's that pre-delayed snare, and I'll show you how to make one of those in this video. There's one of those closed snares, definitely has a clap vibe to it. Now here's a dubstep snare. This is from Vengeance. The reverb tail and the gated reverb that it has. Again, that's a really high quality sample. If you guys are wondering, why these snares are sounding so good, I'm not mixing them. I'm just pulling high quality samples. I cannot stress how important that is to really, really getting your drum sounds to sound professional. All right, now here is another snare from Vengeance. This is pulled from a loop. Unfortunately, some of their packs don't have one shots. You got cut up loops. So this has like a little hi-hat thingy at the end. But if you were doing a song, it wouldn't be that noticeable, and you could crossfade it out like I did. So yeah, the dubstep snares will typically have almost a tune to them. And the way that you get that tune, and I can show you on one of these other snares, if you want to have a tune element to your snare, you can do it to any sample, which is cool. All you got to do is turn on EQ and then boost. It's usually around 200 or so. You just got to boost with a narrow Q, which means a narrow band. Hear that? You just got to boost a frequency. You're pulling out some of the resonant frequency here in the snare, and you're boosting it so you get a little bit of a tone. That's useful for things like trap, drum and bass, dubstep. So if you have snare samples, that's something that you can easily do to manipulate it to get it to the tune. Now, you're of course going to want to check the tuning and make sure that the frequency you're manipulating is in tune with your song, because if you have a tuned element to your snare, it has to be in tune with your song, just like your kick does. Otherwise, it's just going to not sound right. All right, so there are the different elements that kind of go into snare sounds. Just to recap, you have, the way I like to look at it, it's a layered snare or unlayered. Layered snares are typically going to be the big snare that you hear in your song or your production. Maybe the unlayered snares are offbeat hits or kind of percussive hits. Or maybe in the intro or verse sections, you have a unlayered snare. And then in the drop, you have your layered snare, for that bigness factor. And then in those two categories, you can have any of these variations. You can have a open snare, which kind of has a reverb or a tail that you can't discernibly hear the end of. It just kind of tails out. And then there's the closed snares, which it has like kind of that sound to it. And those have a whole different effect in the mix. And then you have just some different variations where are they tuned, pre-delay, certain things like that. But yeah, there's a quick rundown of some different high quality snare samples that would work in multiple genres. I showed you from dubstep to trap to any genre of EDM right there. So let's show you how to make a pre-delayed snare. We'll do it actually at our tempo. So let's go over to our little production section that we're working with here. I'm going to drag this clap one over. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a good amount of that away. Cut this first part away. All right, and now what I'm going to do is I'm time stretch it. If you hold down Alt on your keyboard, if you're a Logic user, and stretch in, kind of re-stretches the audio. So I want to make this a lot shorter. Hopefully it'll do it. Sometimes Logic doesn't like doing it. All right, there we go. So now we have this little section right here. Okay, so let's now pull another snare sample in, and I'll show you how this pre-delay snare works. So here is another snare. I will position this track under my part that's going to be the beginning section of the snare. All right, and then once we have those snares together, you don't want to do this. The main snare that's going to be playing with the kick, you don't want that happening over here. You don't want to create this sound. You could, it's typically it doesn't work, right? Because it's kind of like this flam hit. So what you're going to want to do is keep that snare, hitting with the kick. This little pre-delay section, this is what's going to happen before it. So you're just going to drag this out a little. So let's listen to this with the kick and snare in context. Do you hear that? I mean, it's a subtle effect, but I think it's a really cool effect. It's really easy to make. So I just took this from that clap sample, or that clap snare. Sounds like that, and then play it together. You get that. Now, if you want to get really specific with the timing of it, you can change your grid to like a 64 division marker, and you can actually sync this up with a grid. So now it's happening. This is happening one tick mark on a 64th beat division before the actual snare. So it's really quick. It's milliseconds here, right? But with your kicks, it can sound pretty cool. So that actually might be too much. So you might need to go at 90 to a 96, because this is a slower tempo. If you were at a faster tempo, like 128, 130, that would work quite well. So let's listen to this. There it is. There is a pre-delay snare. Really easy to make. You can make it with any sample. But it's one extra thing that you can do to add some pop to your snares to kind of really snap out of the mix. So if we listen to this now, I might actually keep this for this little progression that we have going. So that actually, to me, sounds like a better type of snare candidate maybe for like the verses. But yeah, that's one thing that's the difference between those, closed, open, and then if you do the pre-delay. I think the pre-delay adds more attention to the snare. So if we turn this pre-delay section off, hear that difference, just the feeling? Right? One makes your ear really drift to that sound, and one just kind of lets it gloss over. So yeah, it's really cool once you start to get into these different types of snares and play around with them in your track, just the different feeling and vibe that they can evoke in a certain genre or a certain tempo or feel. All right, so I'll see you in the next video where we're going to talk about layering snares.